Hey, what's going on there, folks? Welcome to another edition of GH Reacts. Thanks for checking in. So today's video is all going to be about the Beatles, Get Back, and I've watched the entire thing. I know I'm a little late to the party, but I had to work 6 days in a row, so it was hard to watch it. I had to watch it basically like an hour at a time. So it took me a little bit longer than some other folks, but I've watched the entire thing and I have many thoughts, and I just wanted to talk about some of them. If you really haven't seen this movie yet, I would say, if you don't want any spoilers, then don't listen to me. Even though, this is historical fact, so, a lot of it you're going to know about already, like it's already kind of been written, and the Let It Be movie that was released in 1970 covered a lot of the stuff as well. This is just kind of a more augmented view of it, but I just had like a bunch of thoughts about the film and wanted to talk about it. So I guess we'll start with my overall review of the entire movie. So visually it was very, very good. It was very stunning to see and hear everything so clearly, including the music. Obviously, for me, it was more important to hear what they were saying because I was always interested in that. And obviously, this movie dispels a number of myths that surround the Beatles' breakup, which is number one, Yoko. If you watch the movie, you'll see that everybody brought people. There were points where Paul brought Linda on several occasions. He brought his daughter on one occasion, which led to some pretty cute moments with her and Ringo, and with also her doing the screaming thing and kind of playing off of Yoko a little bit, and them having a moment where, a little bit of a sly smiles between the two of them, which I thought was a really cute moment. And overall, just the Beatles' demeanor, everybody's talking about this. They don't really seem as if they were a band that was breaking up. There was a lot of business talk. The Alan Klein stuff started to kind of fade in, which I could tell, Paul wasn't really feeling Alan Klein at all, and for good reason. In the end, he ended up being right. But, you could tell that they were moving towards, these business decisions that would eventually break up the band. But the number one thing for me, just looking at the Beatles themselves, was that they were so separate now as men, just as people. You look at the Beatles' career, you can kind of break it up into two different things. You have the one side of the Beatles' career, which was, the four of them basically together all the time, every waking moment. They went from hotel to recording studio to show to filming a movie to show, filming a movie, recording studio. It just went on and on and on for the better part of, 4 or 5 years. And once they had basically stopped doing that and decided to turn the band into just, we're going to make our records the show, they also became very separate men. They all had separate love lives, separate families. They had separate interests. One of the things that struck me was, and I don't know if anybody else noticed this, but when they would come in the morning, it was almost like they were coming into the office. Morning, tea, It was just so mundane. It wasn't like you would imagine, the Beatles showing up, like John rushing in and say, I've got this song that's amazing. And, you just have this romanticized view of how the Beatles were. And it was amazing to see them just acting like normal fellas, and growing up, because they were growing up. They were not, they had lived the Beatles machine really going back to Hamburg, playing almost every night and doing these crazy long shows in Hamburg. And, the cavern, and then getting bigger, and then starting to record, and then getting bigger, and, touring Europe and touring America and all that stuff. They just not stopped in a better part of 7-8 years at that point. And now it's the beginning of 1969, and you can tell that this band is four very separate guys. George several times talks about making an album, just getting all the songs out of the way, I think is what he puts it. That All Things Must Pass ended up being the album that got all of the songs out of the way, and that was certainly a little bit better than he let on. Just from the standpoint of the movie itself, I think it was overlong. Let's just be real. Peter Jackson was put in a position where you're watching this film and you're watching all this footage and you're like, well, I can't cut that out. It's the Beatles. I can't cut that out. It's the Beatles. I can't cut that. And I think his editorial mind, which obviously we know about the extended editions of Lord of the Rings, which I consider the definitive versions, though. It's just long. It's very long and it's very plotting. And for people who are not Beatles fans, like hardcore Beatles fans, I would say you're probably going to find 90% of this film boring because, I said to my wife, I made the joke that it was basically, 7 hours of the Beatles farting around in the studio, followed by 1 hour of the most breathtaking playing that I've ever heard. Okay. Now let's talk about for a moment the rooftop, which is obviously remastered, which the sound is just amazing. And the rooftop performance is like when you watch Let It Be for all that time and you listen to the way that they're playing some of these songs in the studio and how they're not quite there. Then they get up on the rooftop and it's just like click, everything just comes together and everything sounded great, and it was mesmerizing. It was mesmerizing to see how good they are, and see that in living color from multiple camera angles. It really puts you in that moment, and I think the intersplicing with, stuff that was going on the ground and everything was really nicely done. And I thought having the entire performance uncut and there was a real treat for Beatles fans. But again, like I'm saying, I think if you're not a hardcore Beatles fan, then you're going to probably find this a little bit, on the boring side. Even I, at a few moments, said like, do we really need this in there? But it did go to show, and it was trying to give you an unvarnished, kind of uncut view of what they did in the studio and how they worked at that time. And I'm sure probably in the past, the songs when John and Paul would bring a song like a She Loves You or Can't Buy Me Love, these songs were pretty much fully formed, and it was just play them. 20 takes, they would just burn through that one song. They knew that was going to be the single, and there you go, But now they literally come to the studio with like hardly anything, and they were writing on the fly. They were writing with just little pieces of songs in some cases and blowing them up into larger songs. And so, I think it was very interesting to see that, obviously. A couple other things I wanted to point out was the gear. So, we actually did not see very much of the 61 Hofner bass that Paul McCartney used during this. We actually saw a lot more of his 63 Hofner bass, which he did use both, and he actually used the Rick, which they showed him picking that up at one point when Glenn Johns asked him to pick up another bass. He picked up the Rickenbacker. I did a video about the 61 Hofner, which was his first violin bass that he'd purchased. The way you could tell the 61 from the 63 is that the 61 Hofner bass has the pickups jammed up right against the neck. Both of them are very close to the neck, whereas the 63, it kind of is more in a classical humbucker style, where one is at the bridge and one is at the neck. And the 63 is what Paul still owns. The 61, at some point during this entire, whatever was going on during this Let It Be session, it disappeared. Matt vanished. Probably stolen, but they have no idea what happened to it. George used Lucy in the very beginning of it, which I thought was amazing. There was a point in the film where Lucy falls over, and you're like, I literally screamed like, Lucy, But that was actually, Lucy goes back to my first episode, really, as the Guitar Historian. If you want to watch it, it's right here. But it's literally the first episode of If Guitars Could Speak I ever did. It was even before I'd called the channel the Guitar Historian. Like, this was the birth of what I do. It was my original idea for the channel. So if you want to see kind of how it all started, that's the video that I would look at. But it was all about Lucy. And he used that a lot. He used the Rosewood Telecaster a lot, which is, an amazing guitar. He also used Rocky a little bit. He used so many different guitars, and that's George. That's what he, normally would do, was use a lot of different guitars. And John, on the other hand, that man was married to his Epiphone Casino. Obviously, the Epiphone Casinos back in those days were U.S. built. They were much, I wouldn't say they're nicer. I mean, they're nicer than their Chinese counterparts today. But Epiphone was a very well-known brand at that time. It was right up on par with Gibson in some ways. Had actually been making electric guitars longer than Gibson, I believe. That casino followed him everywhere. He even said at one point, I'm going to leave my favorite guitar here, so I definitely come back tomorrow. And the favorite guitar was the Epiphone Casino. which had been stripped down to natural. So it was really cool to see some of the equipment that was being used. You saw a lot of the Fender Bass 6, which was the 6-string Fender bass, which is basically like thick bass strings on a guitar-sized instrument. So John and Paul would normally use those on songs that Paul was either playing piano or he was just playing a different instrument, and they would play the bass. And that was what they would use if they had to play the bass. So the songs, you had a lot of different songs that you saw in their nascent stages. John had a song that he was kicking around called Child of Nature, which would eventually become Jealous Guy. It was in the same exact, formula as that song. You heard All Things Must Pass, obviously. You heard a lot of George's stuff. That eventually, you heard something. We didn't hear Here Comes the Sun. I think that was written relatively quickly. But we heard something. We heard, several other things. And, obviously the songs that they ended up doing on the Rooftop, they were all Lennon McCartney songs, I believe. They didn't do any of George's songs. But they did Get Back several times. They did Don't Let Me Down. They did I Dig a Pony. I've Got a Feeling. So, it was just, obviously the Let It Be album ended up becoming like part of that. And it sounded like to me, to my ears, that the Let It Be album used those Rooftop performances for the album. So that was really cool to hear those actually being recorded live because, that they were definitive versions. Like Don't Let Me Down on the Rooftop is probably the best version that exists. They're just perfect. I mean, the vocals are perfect. The guitars are perfect. Everything is just absolutely perfect. I don't know how they were able to get such a good sound in the open air like that. It was just incredible how good it sounded. Now, a couple of the players, I wanted to kind of talk about some of the ancillary people. It's kind of like my All Things Must Pass video where I talk about all the other musicians that played on it. But there were a lot of people kind of walking around the entire proceeding that you might not know who they are. So I figured I would tell you a few people just so you know who they were. So, obviously we had George Martin walking around. If you don't know who George Martin is and you're a Beatles fan, then I don't know what to tell you. George Martin was the Beatles producer for their entire career. He produced every song that they ever did. And then eventually Phil Spector went in and reproduced the Let It Be album to kind of make it into an album. But the original recordings were technically produced by George Martin. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, I was watching that and all I saw was this guy, Glenn Johns. Glenn. They were yelling at him all the time. But Glenn, fix my mic. Glenn, why are the PAs on? So Glenn Johns was technically the engineer. In those days, I think the engineer was more like the boots on the ground guy who was much more in tune with what was going on with the band. Glenn Johns would obviously go on to a very historic career in his own right. Most notably, he produced a lot of the Who stuff, the Who's next album. So he had a lot of great credits to his name that would come later on. You saw Alan Parsons from the Alan Parsons Project, Eye in the Sky guy. Very young Alan Parsons in there. Who else did we see walking around? We saw Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans. So these two guys, it's kind of hard to explain what they were to the Beatles, but the two of them were like the personal assistants to the band. Neil was more of like the guy who, like, he was technically the road manager in the early days. And then he ended up being more, they gave him a title that was more like managing director in some ways or whatever. But Neil Aspinall was a very close friend of the band. He used to drive them around to a lot of their very early gigs. He was there all the time. And Mal Evans was the Beatles road manager later on. He was known for being a very strong, very, burly guy. He would be able to lift amplifiers and do a lot of the heavy lifting that the band needed. And Mal was just you could tell he was a very sweet, very open guy who the Beatles loved dearly. So you had all these people kind of just orbiting the Beatles all the time. And it was very interesting to see, the interactions and everything. And, there were a couple of moments in the film where there was one time where they had a hidden tape recorder in a flower vase, which I thought was kind of underhanded. But it was a conversation between John and Paul and the reason why George had left the group for that short period of time. And I'll tell you why he left the group if anybody wants my opinion on it. It was a very passive aggressive way to do it, the way that he left. But the point is that I think he left the group because he felt as though they weren't really accomplishing anything at the time. That was problem one. Problem two was that when Paul said to John, like, can you focus on me while we're trying to arrange the song? He had this thing in his mind that Paul was like the Napoleon. And Paul had taken a very kind of leadership role in the band. And he actually alluded to it a couple of times in this film where he talked about being, I think the word he used was scared that, he would mess it up because he'd been doing it for 2 or 3 years now. And that being, him kind of leading the band into Sgt. Pepper, into Magical Mystery Tour, and now into this Let It Be project. And because John was just kind of like not really as focused on the direction of the band. I think he just wanted to write songs and rock out and put all that noise away. So, there were a lot of dynamics going on. And then, George obviously didn't feel as though he was able to really contribute anything. Now, if you notice the George before that happened and then after that happened, you notice how much more vocal he was. You noticed how much more he was able to enjoy playing guitar. Like the times where, like that one note that he plays on I've Got a Feeling, that, and he's like digging into it on the guitar, and you're just kind of like, all right, George, that's a way to make one note sound like a million. That inflection point when he just decided, I've had enough. Like, I'm not contributing anything. I'm not getting anything done here. It's just kind of a waste of my time. Paul's telling John what to do. This is just ridiculous. I don't feel like it's not healthy anymore. So he just left. Now, obviously, they were able to talk him into coming back. And, they recorded that album and they recorded Abbey Road. So, he was around and he was obviously a force to be reckoned with at that time. But I think George, had a valid reason for stepping away for a few days and just kind of like getting his head straight. And, like they were all surprised when they heard like he went back to Liverpool. I guess maybe he just went back to Liverpool to kind of like go home for a while, to just kind of get away from London, get away from the Beatles, just take a couple of days to get himself together. And I think after he came back from that, that's when they had another meeting with him and it all kind of went better. So, it was just fascinating overall. I can go on about it forever and ever, but, like I said, for people who are not like hardcore Beatles fans like myself, it might be hard to kind of watch the entire thing. And I get that totally as being like the main problem with the film is that it's just too long. I think that if he'd given himself, you want to do 3 parts, great, but just keep them at about 2 hours each. I felt like the second part being like almost 3 hours was kind of dumb. And I think that if you'd done like an hour and a half plus the rooftop on the third part, that would have been kind of like perfect. I just feel like there was a lot of stuff in there that probably could have gotten, chopped out. But overall, it was a fascinating watch for somebody who's into the Beatles like I am. And, I'm curious as to what your thoughts were on it. So, let me know in the comments what you thought of the film, and let's have a cool discussion about it. Otherwise, I will see you next time on the Guitar Historian channel. And as always, thanks for checking in. See you next time.